Hi again, this is Dan Hickey, coming to you with another short video on the practices, principles, and policies of educational assessment. This video concerns the topic of standardized testing. We'll discuss some of the practices and some of the principles, but mostly you'll be thinking, if you're a teacher, an educator, an administrator, you'll be thinking of standardized testing really in terms of policies. This video is intended to help you deal with the policies that come up around standardized testing in your own educational practice. Let's start by discussing what makes a test standardized. One of the key differences with the standardized test is that all takers answer the same questions. Now, these items usually come from a common bank of items. Commercial tests in particular draw from large pools of very carefully constructed items of known difficulty. The items on a standardized test are scored in a so-called standard manner. These items may or may not be connected to standards or educational standards, as you're likely familiar with. Educational standards are collections of curricular aims that states or countries have agreed upon. Those are typically measured, achievement of those standards is measured using standardized tests, but there are many standardized tests that are not associated with educational standards or other standards. In fact, many standardized tests, such as those used in psychological measurement, aren't aligned to standards at all, but rather they're aligned to a psychological construct that's been theoretically developed. Standardized tests are usually given to large numbers of test takers. They're developed for comparing large number of people in a standardized manner, and they're developed using sophisticated psychometric techniques. We won't get into these techniques in this video, but it's important to know that there are a lot of assumptions that go into making standardized tests, and many of these relate to a technique known as item response theory, or IRT. The beauty of IRT is that it lets test developers know, it lets them figure out how difficult each item is relative to all of the other items in the pool. Once you've done this, it allows you to create different versions of the same test, and it allows you to equate different tests. Typically, standardized tests involve selected response items. However, there are quite a few exceptions to this. For instance, in the familiar standardized writing tests, where all test takers complete the same prompt, a standardized prompt, so to speak, and then those responses from the writers, from the students, are then scored in a very standardized manner, often using computers and humans. You also have standardized performance assessments. There was a big push in the 90s in the US and in Europe to reform testing using standardized performance assessments. This became quite problematic for some of the reasons we'll talk about today. As you'll learn, some of the assumptions that go into standardized tests are difficult to do with more open-ended formats. In recent years, we've seen the emergence of the so-called evidence-centered design. Many of the American states that are part of the Smarter Balanced Assessment Coalition will be implementing these new assessments. These are standardized tests. However, they use a very different model of psychometrics to allow test takers, in fact, in some cases, to answer different items, or to answer different items depending on their response to a prior item. And that raises a lot of very complicated issues. So just be aware that things are changing. There's a lot of new formats coming out now, and in particular, the use of technology is really changing standardized testing very quickly. It's important to think about the context in which you work and how that relates to standardized testing, perhaps more than any other aspect of educational assessment. This is because standardized testing that relates to you is dictated by that context. In other words, you don't have very much control over it in many cases. A lot of times, as an educator or an administrator, and often as a researcher, the broader context in which you're doing your work is dictating the standardized testing that will be used in that setting. Standardized tests are very expensive to develop. They must be securely administered, and this is a big issue. They take a lot of time and a lot of money to develop, and then they actually take up quite a bit of time to administer as well. Those of you who work in schools can know that enormous amounts of instructional time ends up being dedicated to standardized testing. Now, some of you may do standardization process with your classroom assessments. For instance, if you are a faculty member and you work with multiple instructors teaching the same course, this happens in secondary school sometimes as well. You want to take some time and think about how your understanding and your knowledge of standardized testing is impacted by the role and the domain in which you teach. For example, in my own courses, my graduate level courses in educational assessment and educational psychology, now, there's no really standardized test out there. I suspect I could probably find one to administer. Now, I do know that many of my students, when they're in pre-service education, are going to face standardized tests of the concepts that they're learning in my course. It's really in my own research where I really encounter standardized tests a lot. A lot of what I do in my research is I align semi-formal and informal classroom assessments to external achievement tests. And now, those tests are really important because they allow me to make claims that my interventions, my efforts, and my improvements when I'm collaborating with people really will lead to gains on other standardized tests that the students face. Now I'd like to talk about interpreting test scores. There are two ways of thinking about interpreting standardized test scores. Many of you will end up interpreting scores as they relate to individual students, but it's important to understand how scores are interpreted for groups as well. Most of you are probably familiar with the notion of the median score and the range of scores. Now, median is what's known as a measure of central tendency. It's one of several ways of saying how a distribution of scores clusters around the center. Now, the range is a simple way of characterizing the diversity of scores around that central measure. It's really much more appropriate to think in terms of means. Most of you probably know the difference between the median and the mean. Now, the median is easier to understand, of course. It's the middle score, but the mean really captures sort of the average. And rather than range, it's more appropriate to think in terms of standard deviations. Now, let's take a minute here and think about what a standard deviation is. If you look at the diagram on the bottom, you can see what's known as a distribution of scores. Now, this particular distribution is an example of what's known as a normal distribution. You can see that the highest score here is at 0.04 on whatever this is measuring, and you can see that there are more scores at 0.04 than any other one. On either side, you can see that there's a -1 or a +1, and these represent one standard deviation above or below the mean. Now, when scores are normally distributed, as they are in this diagram, when you know the standard deviation, when you calculate the standard deviation, which is relatively simple to calculate, I'm not going to talk about it in this video, but when you do calculate it, you can understand quite a bit about the way those scores are distributed. You can see, for example, that around 68% of the scores fall within plus or minus one standard deviation. In other words, 34.1% of the scores fall within -1 standard deviation, and another 34% are one standard deviation above. Moving out on either side, you can see at -2 and +2, you can see that an additional 13% on either side. What you really see here is that a relatively small proportion of scores occurs beyond -1 or +2 standard deviations, just 2% over there on either side. And then this is a really helpful way of thinking. If someone says a score is 2 standard deviations above the mean, right, you can see that it's higher than almost all the other scores in the distribution. And likewise, if someone says a score is -3 standard deviations below the mean, you can see from that diagram that only 0.1% of the scores fall in that range. Now, most of the time you're going to be concerned with interpreting individual scores. Now, there's 3 common ways that have been used to interpret scores on standardized tests. Traditionally, percentile scores were often reported. You would say that the student scored, for instance, above 50% of the other students in the 3rd grade, or above 75%. Now, that's really easy to interpret, but it's incredibly problematic because what that means depends entirely on the norming group, right? So what sample of 4th graders are you referring to? Is this the 4th graders who took the test? Is this all of the 4th graders in the country, the 4th graders in the state? Both percentile scores and grade level equivalents have largely been replaced by scale scores. Now, the problem here is that scale scores are very difficult to interpret, but they're much more accurate and they're now most widely used. In particular, the advantage of scale scores is they address the issues of equating and equivalence. Now, I'm not going to take the time in this video to really unpack scale scores. I know from my experience that it just won't make much sense at all if I explain it. Instead, I'm going to encourage you to get your hands on a standardized test that's relevant to you and to go through the interpretation guide, and it will explain what scale scores mean in the context of a test that's meaningful to you. And I think you'll find that that's a much easier way to make sense of this complex concept. But I really want to encourage you to dig into it. If you're dealing with standardized tests, and they're reported in scale scores, you're really going to have to help others make sense of what those numbers actually mean. Now let's talk about using achievement test scores. Obviously, the purpose of achievement tests is measuring student achievement. There's a general agreement about how you do that, but what you do with the scores depends on a lot of other factors. Most of you are probably aware of the enormous controversy that surrounds the way that achievement test scores are used in the US and in many other countries. In many cases, achievement scores have been used to compare schools. Many observers argue that most of the benefit that might come from comparing schools on standardized scores was already sort of accomplished as schools struggled to and worked to sort of improve their scores. This turns out to be a really problematic thing. Some argue that that kind of external pressure, that the sort of dysfunctional schools, that people think that achievement scores and that giving them letter grades or whatnot is going to somehow lead them to use that data to improve. And so far that just hasn't been the case. Certainly people haven't given up. It's continuing to happen, but it remains quite problematic. In my opinion, I think a lot of these efforts are quite misguided. They're very laden with political motivations, and in particular, I think that the involvement of commercial testing companies in most achievement testing context is quite problematic. In particular, I'm very critical of the No Child Left Behind Act, where schools were compared against a fixed criteria, an unreachable criteria of all. Many argue now that that was really a politically motivated effort to break the public's confidence in public schools, and it appears to have worked. Again, that's my opinion. Other people disagree with me. Of course, one of the intended uses of achievement test is improving and evaluating instruction. This is really the problematic area, in my opinion. In most school settings, efforts to use scores on achievement tests to directly improve instruction really have led to very little improvement and really many problematic negative consequences. There's a lot of reasons this is the case. In my opinion, the big issue is that the achievement tests are so removed from the actual instruction in the classrooms, both in terms of time and the way the knowledge is represented. Many teachers end up using achievement scores for things like sorting and for placing students in different classes and tracking progress. But in terms of actually improving instruction, most teachers will admit that it's very, very difficult to use those scores. Now, in my own work, I find that standardized testing are essential for the research that I do when I'm improving instruction, but I work very hard to keep those achievement tests very removed from the actual work that I'm doing. So, want to make claims about my work improving achievement, I really have to use those tests. I also find that standardized tests are really useful for what I really like to do, which is try to improve instructional systems over time. I work very hard to align curriculum and assessment in classrooms, and if I want to see whether or not those efforts are improving in the long term, I can't really look at the results on the classroom assessments because I'm aligning the instruction to those assessments. In other words, I'm compromising the validity of the classroom assessments for evaluating my improvements. The only way I can really see whether or not I'm improving over time is comparing gains on achievement tests that are administered in a standardized way. Another use of standardized achievement test scores that you'll probably be hearing about, certainly if you're in the United States and dealing with K-12 education, is evaluating teachers. The Race at the Top initiative that's currently underway in the United States has the evaluation of teachers using standardized test scores really at its center. I'm going to talk about this in another video because this is such a big issue, but this is really quite problematic for many people. What I really want to say is this. Regardless of your opinion of standardized tests, if they're relevant to your area, you really need to understand some of the basics. You need to get your hands on a test interpretation guide for a relevant test and really understand where those scores come from. Then you really want to think about how those scores are being used and how they're intended to be used and how they're actually being used. There's no way to put this lightly. The negative consequences of standardized testing can be quite profound. The positive consequences can be as well, but those have proven quite elusive in recent years. Whether or not these new reforms underway now in the United States and other countries actually have an impact remains to be seen, but either way, it appears that standardized testing is here to stay. So it really behooves you, whatever your role, if you're an administrator, a teacher, and a faculty member, many of you, if you're working in universities, you know that there's enormous pressure to introduce standardized achievement tests in university contexts as well. This is also extremely problematic from a bunch of different perspectives, and I encourage you to pay close attention to these efforts. That's all for this short video on standardized testing. I really hope you'll take some time and dig deeply into resources, textbooks, information on the web, and think about how standardized tests are supposed to be used or intended to be used in your setting and how they're actually being used, and what you might do to take better advantage of the scores that those tests are generating in your setting. Thank you very much.